Hi everyone, this is the follow-up lecture to our attachment emotional development lecture that we had last week. So we talked about attachment patterns, and attachment being that bond that happens between an infant and a primary caregiver, typically a mother, but not necessarily always a mother. It's usually a person that is the one that is taking care of them. It's usually just one single person, although that can sometimes vary depending on culture. And we talked about the way that those attachment patterns are measured via the strange situation popularized by or researched by Mary Ainsworth. She developed this paradigm. So then we talked about different behaviors that caregivers can do that can facilitate this secure attachment. So now, with all of that knowledge about attachment, we're going to move into how that translates into emotional development. And we're also going to look at a few different milestones that children have in terms of their emotional development. So we know that the attachment pattern is linked to emotional development. And remember, the attachment pattern that leads to the best outcomes in general for children is the secure attachment pattern. And then the insecure or disorganized attachment patterns don't lead to the best long-term outcomes for children's development. So insecurely attached children have more fearful emotions and might respond with distress to happy events. Now we've talked about this in terms of the Romanian orphans in the Forgotten Children article, part of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. Those kids did not have a secure attachment, and they did end up responding with distress to happy events. For example, crying at a birthday party that is thrown for you, something that children might typically react as happy. You know, there are presents and there's cake and there are toys and friends. That might be a distressing situation. All right, so let's talk about some other milestones of emotional development. So one thing that infants begin to do is something called social referencing. Social referencing means that when a child or an infant seeks another trusted person's reaction to a situation to see how they should feel about it. So usually the person they're looking toward is their attachment figure, typically their mother. And so they're going to look and they're going to see, like, okay, does this person trust the stranger? I'm going to find out. Or does this person trust this particular situation? I'm going to look and find out. So you can kind of see in the picture, baby's at the doctor. Doctor looks really friendly. She's smiling. She's taking the baby's heartbeat. But baby looks back and references mom. Hey, mom, are you smiling at the doctor? Are you making eye contact with the doctor? Does this seem like a person that you are trusting? All right, well then I'm going to trust them too. This can be displayed as early as 6 months. That's when we would see some of this social referencing going on. This example that I just gave is sort of a friendliness awareness of strangers. Another way we often see this is when kids fall down and get hurt. So imagine a kid that, is maybe 18 months or 2 years, sort of a toddler age kid, and they're walking and they're kind of getting used to walking down the sidewalk, and they've got their little tennis shoes on and they trip and fall. And it's a minor trip and fall, and the first thing often a toddler does is look at their attachment figure and see what their reaction is. And if their reaction is worried and afraid and shocked, then the child will react the same way. So they will also start to cry and declare this an emergency. If, on the other hand, the attachment figure says, okay, no big deal, brush it off, you're fine, it was just a tiny bump, then the baby or child will in turn react the same way. So that is social referencing. That's a key milestone in emotional development. All right, so this one we talked about a bit in class. I'm going to cover it a little bit more in this lecture. So this is that idea of emotion regulation. You should already have this in your notes because we talked about it, but let's revisit it. So the definition of emotion regulation is simply the ways that young children can control their own emotions. And remember, this is slowly developing throughout infancy and early childhood. So it might look like getting frustrated but remaining calm anyway. And it's also really closely tied to brain development. So that means that there are parts of the brain that are responsible for emotion regulation that develop throughout infancy and early childhood. And until those connections in those parts of the brain are developed, children should not be expected to regulate their own emotions because their brains simply are not wired for it yet. Now we know that secure attachment leads to better emotion regulation. One of the reasons why that is because of all of those behaviors that the caregiver exhibits that foster secure attachment. So remember, we had a slide that was about sensitive caregiving. All the different things that have to do with sensitive caregiving promote a secure attachment between the attachment figure and the infant. Those behaviors are responsiveness, using a calm and positive tone of voice, setting high expectations, making sure to respond to the infant's needs, using matched affect. So if baby is sad, you empathize with them. You show empathy. If baby's happy, hey, you match that affect too. So those are the behaviors that we exhibit as caregivers to make sure that the infant feels secure. So this really ties closely into letting a baby cry it out. Letting a baby cry it out is not responsive parenting or not responsive caregiving, because infant does not learn that when I'm upset, you are here to calm me. And since their bodies, their brains are not ready to regulate their own emotions yet, this is not an effective strategy to promote emotion regulation. What is an effective strategy to promote emotion regulation is to sort of create a feedback loop. Baby gets excited, worked up, upset, cries. Caregiver comes, holds them, soothes them, calms them down. Their heart rate decreases. Their mind becomes calm. They are soothed. Their body internally sees this feedback loop of getting worked up, getting upset, somebody soothes me, now I am calm. Now the event is over. And it just happens over and over and over again. Every time you get upset, somebody soothes you, you feel better. Every time you get upset, somebody soothes you, you feel better. And the more times that happens on a regular basis and that you can build trust and rely that somebody is going to be responsive to you, the better the parts of your brain connect that are responsible for emotion regulation. So that's how that works, and that's why we've got some myths around letting very young infants sort of cry it out and learn a lesson, when really they're not learning a lesson at all and is least effective. Now there's one caveat to this, and that is that there are some situations where it's okay for a baby to cry for a couple of minutes at a time. What I'm describing here is when that is the norm, when that is all that baby knows, is that somebody always lets me cry it out. Every once in a while, parents are busy, they have to take a shower, they have to go to the bathroom, they're at the checkout. You can't always respond to every infant cry every second of the day, and that is normal. That's within the normal range of, allowing an infant to experience that distress for a few minutes. But what I'm talking about is when that's just how it is all the time. And that's what can lead to, insecure attachment and emotion dysregulation. All right, so this is kind of exciting. This is a key part of emotional development. So when we think about emotional development, we often think about happy, sad, fearful, excited, like the feelings that we feel. But another piece of emotional development in childhood is the development of the self. And so what that means is that children are starting to develop a pre-identity. Young children don't have an identity yet. They have what's called a self. And later in adolescence, that transforms into an identity. But forming an identity in early childhood, according to developmental theory, is just not a thing. So we have a couple of ways of measuring this. So the very first way that infants develop a sense of self is through what's called a self-concept. And self-concept is just the idea that you are an entity that is separate from all the other entities. So you kind of start to have like a self-awareness. Like, wow, I'm a person in this world and this is who I am. And you think that like maybe we're all born with this? No, we're not. It really starts to develop that. An infant starts to understand that they are this independent being, independent from all the other people. And so a couple of ways that we measure this in developmental science is one really famous thing called the Rouge test. And babies pass this at around 18 months. And the way the Rouge test works is this top photograph. You kind of sneakily put a little bit of rouge or makeup or marking on baby's nose or on their cheek or something. And then you place them in front of a mirror. And if baby touches the mirror and tries to rub that mark off the baby in the mirror's face, then they don't really understand that it's them. But if they instantly touch their own face and say, hey, that's me, and there's something on my face, it's sort of an indication that they understand that the reflection is indeed them. That's one lab test that developmental scientists do to measure self-concept. Later on, at about 2 years, children are able to identify themselves in photos, like that's me, that's the baby, and they start to use their own name or the word I. And that's sort of ways that we can see that self-concept is developing. All right, so once kids start to have this self-awareness, the more that develops, the more it impacts social and emotional development. So the more you understand yourself, the more you understand the other people around you or entities too. So that's when kids start to think about sharing or cooperative behaviors. If somebody drops something, I'll pick it up for you. It also facilitates this development of self-conscious emotions. So until you understand the sense of self, you don't really understand things like embarrassment, envy, empathy, pride, guilt, shame. All those things start to come on board once you realize that you are indeed a person separate from the other people. So once you start to have a self-concept, that's when kids start to feel guilty or embarrassed about things. Like oftentimes we see this around toileting, that children want privacy around toilet training, or if kids are, doing a poopy diaper and they kind of like hide off in the corner. Little babies don't care who they're pooping around, but once they get to be around 2 years old, they start to be able to have the capacity to feel guilt, shame, embarrassment. So then they go hide behind the couch and do it. So those of you who have seen kids mess up a diaper, that's kind of how that develops. All right, that is all I have for you today. That's a nice summary for you about emotional development. Please follow up with what is in the textbook because that will supplement your knowledge on emotional development.